Good morning, WTOB listeners. This is Dylan Greenwood along with Harold Eustache. We're here to present to you For the Record with Greenwood Law this morning, and we're talking about an issue that has been in the news probably a little bit more than you'd care to see, especially over the last year, and that's the issue of hate crimes. There's been some pretty infamous things that have occurred across the country, most recently of which happened down in Georgia with a series of shootings that happened at massage parlors and these day spas. The individual who committed these crimes was a white man, and every one of his victims was female, and all but two of his victims were of Asian descent. And a lot of people have keyed in on what occurred down there and have looked at it as a possible display of Asian hate. The officials down in Georgia have been reluctant to put a label on it. They've kept everything pretty much to the facts, which that's probably a good thing, right. Given the ability of things to really blow up, especially given our culture and our society right now. One of the things that we talk about quite a bit are the pros and cons of social media. Again, that plays into that as well. But what you've got right now is a situation where we don't know what someone's motive was, but it's suspected that it might be some sort of hate-related crime. And so because of that, it has really put these issues under scrutiny, especially here in the South, where you do have less and less impactful hate crime legislation and laws.
That's correct.
And I think in the United States, every single state has some sort of hate crime law, except for like four. I think it's Georgia, Arkansas, Wyoming, and I think South Carolina. So you do have this situation where it has been legislated. There are crimes that involve that are hate crime designations, but how that plays out in reality versus what is written on paper are two entirely different things, aren't they, Harold?
They are. And there's, for our audience, there's a federal hate crimes bill as well that deals with these hate crimes. But in North Carolina, based on some of the stuff that happened just a few weeks ago in Atlanta, there's been this push to revisit the Hate Crimes Prevention Act that was pushed by 3 North Carolina state senators, one out of Mecklenburg, Wake County, and Orange County, and they have this bill that tries to stiffen up some of the hate crimes legislation in North Carolina that we already have. Just for our viewers, the hate crimes stuff in North Carolina is not extremely robust compared to other states. Essentially, it's an aggravating enhancement to our criminal statute. So it's a sentencing issue rather than being its own criminal statute. And so part of what this Hate Crimes Prevention Act wants to do is make some very specific criminal offenses that come from hate crimes that make hate crimes a specific criminal offense, not just an aggravating enhancement. That's what the intent is. And also, part of the intent here is also to catalog hate crimes. North Carolina is one of the states that doesn't register or track hate crimes the same way some other states do. And so part of this Hate Crimes Prevention Act is to track these hate crimes and to get the data to see what exactly is occurring.
Yeah, because I know that the FBI keeps a lot of data on all types of crime that goes on in the United States, and it's unbelievable to look at everything that they track. And one of the interesting things that you brought to my attention, Harold, was the tracking of hate crime as it related to Asian populations in the wake of what happened down in Georgia. And it's interesting to see this graph that it started very high in the mid-90s. I mean, just surprisingly so. And then steadily declined throughout the 90s and into the 2000s. And then you see an uptick, especially around the beginning of 2020. And it seems like it very much coincides with the pandemic that started. And there were some statements and some feelings that were put out into the world about where that pandemic originated, how it originated.
Right.
And some people coined it, that it was like this Asian flu or this Asian pandemic. And so, it definitely, in a society where we like to see where we can place blame, it became an easy way to do that.
Yeah, and the numbers in 2020 are pretty staggering as far as what's occurred. I mean, especially looking at New York City particularly, where hate crimes or crimes targeted at Asian Americans has like 600% increase or something. So it's hard to say that that's just a random thing. It's pretty evident that there's something going on there. And so what we want to do today is talk about what these hate crimes really are, how they are prosecuted, and what, if any, issues there are related to these hate crimes. So, one example of one of the hate crimes laws we have in North Carolina is an ethnic intimidation law. It's the only real statute we have that criminalizes this sort of behavior specifically. And what it says is that it makes it a crime for a person to assault or deface property or threaten another person based on race, color, religion, nationality, or country of origin, and makes it a Class 1 misdemeanor. It also makes it a Class 1 misdemeanor to teach people to do that. I don't know, but I think that teaching part came out of the legislature wanting to get rid of some of these rallies and stuff and things like that. But what's interesting about this is really about kind of a threat, and it can deal with assaults too. But it's just based on race, color, religion, nationality, and country of origin. And a lot of the recent hate crime legislation takes it much, much further and talks about many other categories of people. Oh yeah,
the bill that was introduced in the North Carolina legislature really expands. It uses that statute that you referred to, Harold, but then takes it even further and talks about a victim's race, ethnicity, color, religion, nationality, country of origin, gender identity, gender expression, disability, or sexual orientation. So all of a sudden, you took what was pretty much more narrowly tailored for ethnicity and race, and you broadened it to all these other potential groups. Because people have gotten targeted for their sexuality. They have been targeted for their gender. They have been targeted for their ethnicity. They have been targeted for their race. They have been targeted for their religious expression. And those are not good things at all. I understand why these laws are in place, and what they end up doing is the proposed legislation says that if any Class 2 or 3 misdemeanor, any one of them, can be shown to be committed because of the victim's whatever their identity is, then it is therefore enhanced to a Class 1 misdemeanor. And if any Class A1 or Class 1 misdemeanor is committed because of one of those identifying features of the victim, then that is therefore raised to a Class H felony. So, Harold, you were a prosecutor.
Mm-hmm.
You ever prosecuted a hate crime issue?
I have not a hate crime issue in the sense of that was part of the statute, but have prosecuted many and dealt with many crimes that dealt with race and stuff like that.
It comes up all the time.
All the time.
Absolutely. But, put your prosecutor hat on for a second.
Right.
If all of a sudden you've got to prove that a crime was committed due to one of these identifying features, due to someone's race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, how are you going to prove that?
It's very difficult. I mean, generally, and that's one of the issues with hate crime legislation, and some of the examples that we actually do see when people are prosecuted under hate crimes legislation. A lot of times it is very specific. For example, there was an instance in El Paso, Texas, where a person was indicted federally for a shooting at a Walmart there, a mass shooting at a Walmart. And the reason he was prosecuted under the hate crimes legislation is, one, he illegally possessed a firearm, which kind of got it under the federal prosecution. But then he also had a whole manifesto on, I believe it was Facebook, talking about how, Latino and Hispanic people coming into the country was an infestation. I mean, he made it very, very specific as to why he was committing this offense. And that's what you see for, that's the sort of the standard you would need, a kind of a manifesto right there that this person is making, saying, I'm committing this crime specifically because of race, gender, nationality, whatever. But a lot of times we don't have that. So if you're a prosecutor, it's going to make it difficult to say, well, for example, the issue in even what's going on in Georgia, to say, well, I don't think there's that manifesto there. So it makes it difficult to say, well, yes, there is this there's this group of victims who may look a certain way, but how do you say beyond a reasonable doubt that this was because of the way people look? And that's sort of the hang up that many prosecutors have dealt with when it comes to hate crimes legislation. And even here in this bill where you referenced A1 misdemeanors being enhanced, the first thing I think about is that in North Carolina we have a crime called assault on a female, which is an A1 misdemeanor. And one of the elements of that crime is being a female. And so here it references gender and any A1 misdemeanor being enhanced to a Class H felony. And we could see all sorts of kind of issues creeping in about whether are all these assaults on a female hate crimes because gender's there. I mean, it would just be very interesting to see what happens.
I couldn't imagine being in the shoes of a prosecutor and trying to parse out, did this assault happen for the reason of the victim being female? That's basically what you have to show.
Right.
So right now, it's an A1 misdemeanor if a male assaults a female in North Carolina. Just those things have to exist. If they do, then it's an A1 misdemeanor. It's no longer a simple assault, which is a Class 2 misdemeanor. It's an A1 misdemeanor. But if you can then, as a prosecutor, show that the assault didn't just happen because they had those characteristics, but because of the victim's characteristic of being a female, then all of a sudden there could be a potential for a Class H felony, which then triggers a lot of other things. And then you have to figure out, is this, does going after this enhancement as a hate crime, all of a sudden that could pull it into Superior Court. Then, if the prosecutor fails to prove that the hate crime exists, can he fall back on the A1 misdemeanor as a lesser included? I mean, there's all these potential trial issues that come up in this. One of the other huge issues that comes up in this legislation as proposed in North Carolina is that there is a caveat that is carved out that evidence of expression or association of the accused individual may not be introduced as substantive evidence at a trial unless the evidence specifically relates to the crime charged. So I'm sure that a lot of people listening or viewing this would go, well, gosh, guys, y'all are talking about how hard this is to prove, but if you can just show that they're a part of some hate group or they're a neo-Nazi or whatever else, it's obvious if they do something against somebody else, that's what they believe. They're part of one of these groups. Therefore, it has to be because of that association. Well, there's a few issues with that.
Mm-hmm.
The law and evidence, the law of evidence and how it comes into court has a protection, a slant towards protecting the accused individual. We have made it clear in our criminal justice system that we would rather protect the rights of the accused when it gets down to it. If all things being equal, you protect the rights of the accused. And we try our best to exclude evidence which would be unfairly prejudicial against that defendant at a trial. So if you're trying to make the connection, well, they associate with, such and such group, therefore they must think these things, that may not necessarily be true. It may not, it very well could be, but you don't know that. And the other issue that you have there that really you start poking around in, or why you think that caveat might be put into the law, is because then you start encroaching in on First Amendment grounds.
Sure, and the ability to assemble and the ability to be part of different groups. It's very much a part of America to be parts of different groups that people may like or may not like, but that's the way it is. And if we start using that in the criminal context, it could be dangerous. And I think that's important to have in this legislation if it were to pass. To have that.
I absolutely agree, because there are many groups out there that personally I don't agree with,
Sure.
and I'm sure that many people don't agree with. But at the same time, very much like our Constitution and our government and way of life that we have here in the United States, and for better or for worse, groups are protected. The right to assemble is protected under the First Amendment, and the government is prevented from being able to encroach upon that right. And the moment you start saying, well, it's okay for us to encroach on this group's right because of who they are, then that's a path that is tough to come back from, because then you're forever going down that path.
Yeah.
Because where does it end?
Right. That's one of, obviously hate crimes legislation comes out of, the want to protect people that have, traditionally
not
been
have
victims,
those protections.
Right, not have these protections, been victims of all sorts of crimes. It comes out of a very good place. But there's also some opposition to it. And the opposition a lot of times comes from issues around the First Amendment, as you alluded to. There's a case here in North Carolina that one of the only cases that really deals with that ethnic intimidation statute that I talked about earlier. And so the North Carolina courts get to kind of delve into this a little bit. And what happened in that case was in Cabarrus County, a principal, an African-American female principal, was sent an email, and the email had a lot of racial epithets in it, and a lot of essentially threatened her and said that if you continue to suspend students for doing certain things, then the KKK will show up at your door and commit violence against you. And that the person who sent the email was convicted and appealed it based on these grounds that this is protected speech, and this shouldn't be a criminal offense. And the court said that it should because it was a threat, and because of the issues around the threat of violence, and not necessarily the speech itself. So, and that goes to the point about hate crimes. A lot of the hate crimes, there's an underlying crime, whether it be defacing property, some sort of assault, some sort of threat. But hate crime in and of itself, calling someone a bad name or that sort of stuff is not a crime. And that's where this becomes, it can become controversial, it can become nuanced. But again, we have to remember that these kinds of some speech that we don't like is protected in America. And so, we have to wonder whether that will be criminalized or not, and we don't want that. But again, in North Carolina, the courts did allow this statute for ethnic intimidation to hold because it was considered a threat. The other issue could be about equal protection and whether or not there are different groups being treated differently based on these hate crimes laws. The courts haven't necessarily delved into that too much, but that is an issue you could see people certainly bringing up. I guess we say all that to say that, again, hate crimes legislation comes out of a place of wanting to help, but there are a lot of interesting legal issues about how it is actually put in practice.
If you're just joining us here on WTOB, it's Dylan Greenwood here with Harold Eustache on For the Record with Greenwood Law as we talk about hate crimes legislation here in North Carolina. It's back on the legislative agenda in a more robust fashion. North Carolina does have some hate crimes related laws and statutes that have been put on the books. You don't see them prosecuted all that frequently, but the new legislation that's been put out there definitely expands it, and so there's a possibility that it could. One of the things that we've brought up here about these types of issues is an equal protection issue. And equal protection, it's a easy thing to get thrown around. It's equal protection. You got to treat us equally. You got to treat us fairly. Well, yes, that's the way it should be. People should all be treated equally and fairly. That does not always happen in every facet of life. Sometimes that's just life.
Right.
Equal protection as it relates to the government is what we're referring to here. And I think a lot of times, again, the concept, because, people want life to be fair, the concept of equal protection is thrown around pretty flippantly.
Right, just like freedom of speech is thrown around.
Yeah, freedom of speech. Yeah, we've been through that before. So on equal protection, what we're saying is that there's a chance, and something that needs to be really looked at is whether or not these hate crimes get applied in certain directions.
Right, and I think that's important. Because the laws themselves do say, any expression of disability, gender, sexual orientation, origin, race, ethnicity, and that doesn't. I think generally people think, well, that means protected classes. That means African Americans, that means Asian Americans, that means women, but the law doesn't say that it has to be that. And so I think part of the argument is, all right, well, if there are crimes that go the other way, are those also hate crimes, and are they prosecuted as hate crimes? And I don't know that there's the numbers on that, but I think it is important for us to keep these numbers to see whether that happens.
Well, the legislation says that you got to do that,
right? And
you could very easily see that let's say this is all one direction. So let's say it's all man against woman. That's every gender related prosecution of this bill is men against women, and there's no evidence of it prosecuted women against men. You potentially have an equal protection issue under the Constitution, because as it is applied would violate the equal protection aspects of the Constitution, which could then lead to an invalidation of the statute as applied and could potentially undo convictions related to it if you're applying an unconstitutional statute.
Right. I mean, and that's kind of would be up to lawyers to bring that kind of suit. But I think if you did see those kind of numbers, you would see those types of suits in appellate court and even the state Supreme Courts and federal courts and stuff like that, because courts would really have to look at how is this applied, and is it applied in a way that's fair and equal, or for everybody, because sometimes there are laws that are written where they don't, even though the law looks neutral, sometimes in its application it's applied in a way that isn't. And so the courts would have to delve into that. But it is an important aspect of this because these laws have to be specific enough and focused enough to actually do the things that they are saying they want to do and protect the groups that they're saying they want to protect, so that they don't, they're not overly broad somehow or violate parts of the Equal Protection Clause, which, again, would overturn these laws. So I think in the coming years we'll see quite a bit of legislation around hate crimes, even more than we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years. And there will be more court cases that really delve into what hate crimes are, what they are not. And I think the courts will sort of help sort some of this stuff out eventually. Now, I know we hit on, Dylan, a couple parts of the Hate Crimes Prevention Act that's coming up in the legislature. But is there another part of this act that you'd be interested in?
Yeah, so one of my favorite parts that I see is the increased amount of training for law enforcement and prosecutors as it relates to this. I've always been a big proponent of more training. We've had an increase in the militarization, if you will, of law enforcement over the years, and because it's a lot easier to buy equipment than it is to train. It seems is probably cheaper in the end. I don't know that for sure, but my gut feeling tells me that. Mm-hmm. And what this does is it calls for more training in the end, and I think that that's an excellent aspect of this bill, both in identifying hate crimes and in prosecuting those hate crimes.
No, I agree, Dylan, that the training piece is very, very important for both law enforcement and prosecutors. This bill lays out that the Conference of DAs even would have to train prosecutors. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this discussion that we've had on hate crimes. We wish we could go longer and talk more about it, but that's what we try to do here on For the Record with Greenwood Law. We try to just delve into these different legal topics, and we're going to do that again next week. So please join us next week as we talk about a legal issue that we hope will speak to you and will inform you about the law.
Before we go, do not forget the Greenwood Law Bill of Rights, and that's first and foremost, I will not represent myself in a court of law. Second, I will not do law enforcement's job for them. 3, I will not make statements when stopped by law enforcement. 4, I will not consent to searches when stopped by law enforcement. And 5, I will not be my own star witness for the prosecution. Remember, everybody, it's not a crime to know your rights and assert them. Stay safe out there. This is For the Record with Greenwood Law, signing off.